Hello. So today's lesson is going to be a little bit different to some of the other lessons that you've had. This is going to be a feedback lesson. The idea is that you'll get some whole class feedback based on a recent question that you did for me about Typhoon Haiyan. So the idea is that we'll have a look at the question, we'll have a look at the success criteria that goes to the question, and we're going to look at two examples of students' answers, which I've anonymized, but they're students from your class. And we'll look at how they link to the different pieces of success criteria. Now, the idea is that by doing that, what you guys can then do is you can go away and do some dirt activities, and you can have a little re-go at redoing the question if there are any improvements that you need to make. So without further ado, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to present my screen to you now, and I'm going to go over to my slide deck up here in my top tab, which says feedback lesson. Now, I'm not going to present the whole screen because actually what I want to do is I want to use some highlighters to be able to highlight some things within people's answers as we start to go along. So the question that I said that you guys were going to get feedback on was this, and it says use a named example to explain the primary and secondary effects of a tropical storm. Now, when I did the lesson, we went through that process that we go through all the time. We boxed our command word and we said that our command word was explain. Okay, and actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight that word explain now, because if we know that the command word is explain, we know that we need to be using lots of connectives in order to answer our question. We would have gone through and we underlined named example. And by underlining named example, it got it fresh in our minds that we were looking at a named example of a tropical storm. And hopefully by the time you get into year 11, you'd have done lots of revision and your brain will be able to make those connections. Named example, tropical storm, Typhoon Haiyan. And then the other thing that we would probably underline would be the primary effects and secondary effects, because it's testing your knowledge, not only of the case study, but it's also testing your knowledge of what the difference is between a primary effect and a secondary effect. Now, in order for you to answer that question, here's the success criteria. You needed to identify the differences between primary and secondary effects. You needed to explain three primary effects, which means that you needed to use connectives in order to be able to do it. You needed to do exactly the same for secondary effects, and you needed to give specific information on a tropical storm. So remember, anyone can say that tropical storms destroy buildings. The people that are going to get the marks are the people that know the real world examples of places and locations across the world. So the first example that we're going to look at is this one. Okay, now I'm going to read it through. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight each of these different strands on the success criteria, and we're going to see what this answer gives us in terms of the success criteria. And then from that, we'll be able to give it a what went well and an even better if. So it starts in 2013, the super typhoon Haiyan hit the Philippines. The typhoon had winds of 170 miles an hour, tearing apart huge areas of the country. The strong winds caused the sea level to rise, leading to a massive storm surge. About 6,300 people were killed, most drowned from the storm surge, and left over 60,000 people displaced and 40,000 people with no source of income. Power supplies would be cut off in some areas of the month, and there were shortages of food, water, shelter, and outbreaks of disease. Now, on the face of it, there's lots of really, really specific information in there, but let's just go through the success criteria one bit at a time. So the first thing that we need to do is to identify the difference between a primary effect and a secondary effect. Now, for me, within this particular answer, it's not actually 100% clear that the person that's written it knows the difference between a primary effect and a secondary effect. Now, if I start looking through here and start picking out some of the effects that we've got an effect that is people were killed. So for me, that's a primary effect, and there's one primary effect that's been identified. So I'm just going to change the color of that. Actually, let's change this to primary effects, and let's pop the primary effects in blue. So we've got here, sorry, where were we? Storm surge. Okay, so we've got people were killed. So let's put that down as our primary effect. We then move on to say over 600,000 people were displaced. Okay, again, I would say that's a primary effect because it's a direct result of the tropical storm with no source of income. Now, this potentially could be a secondary effect. So let's see if we can highlight that one in green to show that it's a secondary effect. Power supplies will be cut off for over a month, and there were shortages of food, water, and shelter, and outbreaks of disease. Now, again, I know we're saying that it was cut off for a month, but I would say that that's still a primary effect. Okay, so for me, within this answer, it's clear that the person that's doing it knows that there are impacts and that there are effects of a tropical storm. But what's not 100% clear is that they know the difference between the primary effects and the secondary effects. And when you're answering a question, it's always really important to signpost to the examiner, because we can't presume that the examiner is in your brain reading your mind. So I would always say the primary effects are, give some of the primary effects. The secondary effects are, give some of the secondary effects. And actually what we're not seeing in here is that explanation of the effects. And we're not seeing the explanation of the effects because we're not seeing those connective words. So for example, if we look at this one here, it said it left over 600,000 people displaced and over 40,000 people with no source of income. Well, if you just said 40,000 people with no source of income, as a consequence of living near the coast, it meant that they were reliant upon fishing, which means that boats were destroyed, and because it's an LIC, it's difficult to be able to rebuild its infrastructure or its economy. Then that would make that a far more complicated and complex answer. Now, this bit here, however, I think has been nailed. It says to be able to give specific information on Typhoon Haiyan. Well, let's have a little look at the answer. We've got loads of it. We've got death tolls. We've got the amount of people that have been displaced, which means made homeless. We've got the numbers of people with no source of income. All of that is absolutely fantastic. And let's be honest, the only way that you're going to be able to remember that is by revision when it goes to an exam. Now, the second example that I'm going to show you is a slightly longer example. Again, we'll read it through, but this time we'll see if we can compare it to example 1 to see if we can start to pick out where we've got that depth of explanation and that separating out of primary effects and secondary effects. So it says the Philippines is in southeast of Asia, located north of Australia and south of China. It's a cluster of islands situated in the Pacific Ocean, and it's also on the equator, meaning that it's prone to tropical storms. On November the 3rd, 2013, the country experienced a terrible typhoon named Typhoon Haiyan. It's said to be more powerful and dangerous than Storm Katrina and Sandy put together. Now, this paragraph is really interesting. Now, the reason why this paragraph is really interesting is because there's good geography in the question. However, if we think about our success criteria, which we've got down here, it's not ticking anything off. Now, although that's good geography and that's a nice little introduction, if you did that in an exam, you would run out of time very, very quickly, and that wouldn't pick you up any marks, okay? So what I'm interested in is I'm interested in the bones of the question, which is what I've just highlighted here on the screen. So it goes on to say there were some tragic things that occurred from the typhoon. For example, 6,300 people died, with the majority of them drowning from the storm surge. Also, the storm destroyed 30,000 fishing boats, taking out the country's main source of income. Another primary effect occurred when Typhoon Haiyan was that the Tacloban airport terminal was damaged. This is bad because in the long run, when countries are trying to support them and aid them, they will not be able to help as there isn't anywhere where they can land a full plane of supplies. Okay, so let's just look at this paragraph. Now, in this paragraph, if we look at the success criteria, we need to identify the differences between the primary effects and secondary effects. Well, if we look here, it's really clear that everything in this paragraph is a primary effect, okay? And that's signposted here with this statement that says another primary effect is. So from my perspective, that's a really good aspect of the answer to this question. Now, we also needed to be able to explain 3 primary effects. Now, there's lots of evidence that we've got deeper explanation. And if we look here, we've got connective phrases that are allowing that deeper development within the answer. So not just saying that Tacloban airport terminal was damaged, you're saying this is bad because in the long run, okay? And you're starting to explain those knock-on effects. So from my perspective, that's really, really good. Now, in addition to that, there's also lots and lots of evidence of specific pieces of information. Again, the numbers of fishing boats, the link that makes to the income, Tacloban airport in itself. You know, you don't always have to remember numbers and figures with these case study examples. You know, places and locations are just as important. Let's have a little look. So the next paragraph says, as well as the primary effects from the typhoon, there were also secondary effects. So again, you can see where this student has signposted their answers to the question. Again, specific pieces of information, such as 40 million people affected in total, many homeless, and there were 6 million people who lost their source of income. This will drastically decrease the country's economy. Another secondary effect is that people will go desperate to fires and looting and break out throughout the country. The final secondary effect is that power supplies in some areas will be cut off for a month. This meant that people would not be up to date with news and responses. Now, again, the way that this paragraph is structured is good. The only thing that I would say about this is I think, with the exception of the impact on the country's economy, some of these are still primary effects. So there needs to be just that little bit more clarity about the difference between the primary effect and between the secondary effect. So remember, the primary effect is a direct result. The secondary effect is something that happens as a knock-on effect from it. So from my perspective, power supplies being cut off from a month is still a primary effect because it's not really long lasting. It's something that can be repaired quite easily. But if you're talking about people losing their source of income, and if you're talking about the country's GDP and how that therefore might have an impact on its ability to be able to put in good quality healthcare services, okay, that would be a secondary impact. That's something that's far longer lasting, okay? So what we've got here are two answers which would get us marks in exams. If this was the exam question that we were looking at, both of these would get us answers. This, I would say, would be a level 2 response. Okay. Now, if this were a 6-mark question, it'd be marked level 1, which would be 1 to 2 marks, level 2, which would be 3 to 4 marks, and level 3, which would be 5 to 6 marks. So I think that this first answer here, you'd probably be looking at around about 3 marks. And I think you'd be looking at 3 marks because it doesn't have that explanation. It doesn't have that use of connectives in order to be able to develop its responses. This question, on the other hand, if we ignore this first paragraph, which doesn't answer the question, I think would get us towards the top end of level 2, perhaps into level 3. And I think we're looking at 4 to 5 marks. And that will very much depend upon the examiner that's marked the question and how well they feel that you've got to grips with some of those secondary effects. If it were me, I think I'd be generous. I think I would give this 5 marks as a response out of 6. So what I'd like you guys to do now is I'd like you to go back and have a look at your original answer to the question. Bear in mind the examples that I've just shown you and see if you can start to implement some improvements on your original response as part of your work for your second lesson this week. I would also like to remind you that the academic support timetable is out there. In that academic support timetable, there is time where Mrs. Riddle, as the head of geography, has made herself very, very kindly available to be able to give people support and responses. So if you need a little bit more support, that's your place to go. Look at that timetable. It's out on social media. It's in Google Classrooms. It's in your tutor classrooms to find out where you can get that support from. Okay, right. That's it from me today. That's going to be your work for today's session. Okay, you're going to be going through and having a little look at your answers. If you didn't answer it in the first place, use this as an opportunity to catch up on that work. The last lesson that you did, that was the video lesson, was all about how we can reduce the impacts of tropical storms. It's the first time I've tried doing sort of a recorded, real, live, in inverted commas, lesson with you guys. So any feedback that I can get from that would be absolutely fantastic. Okay, thank you very much and have a great day.